delighted to introduce Lee, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Over to you.
I've got a microphone. Super, good afternoon everyone, how are we doing? Good day so far? Super, so I'm well aware that I stand between you and lunch, so we're going to keep this light, we're going to keep it as quick as we can, because it is that time of day. So yeah, I'm going to be here today speaking about allyship, some stuff about gender equity, a bit about the journey that I've been on, and a bit about the work that I do today. But before I do, I want to ask you a question. Who enjoyed the Olympics? And the Paralympics? Diversity in sport? So lots of hands up, great to see. Diversity, gender parity in Olympians, some progress we definitely see. I could say an awful lot about how diversity doesn't always equal inclusion, but that's for next year. What I will say is that when the Olympics started, for me, in my world, a lot of people in the leadership space absolutely love the Olympics because they absolutely find the ability to pull parallels from elite athletes and pull them into lessons in leadership is truly unparalleled. But I'm quite controversial in how I see the world and what I say, and I actually think that if we look at most elite athletes and then try and take that back into the corporate world, what we actually realise is that they train for 98% of their life to perform just 2% of the time. Whereas in the corporate world, we actually train 2% of the time and perform our role and everything else on the side 98% of the time. So actually, are those lessons really as tangible as they say they are? I would tell the gurus no. But if we look at grassroots sports, there's a hell of a lot of parallels to the reality in business because you're making it happen every single day, you're trying to fit stuff in, you're trying to get some funds together, you're trying to get stuff organised behind the scenes, and then a few people turn up, have a good time, and there you go. So yeah, I think that for me, actually the parallels between grassroots sport and business are something we don't often look at, but actually some of the barriers in grassroots sports are still the barriers that exist for different marginalised groups within the workplace. And that's some of the work that we've been looking at, and it's great to have been able to do some stuff with Sarah over the next few years, actually looking at what those barriers and boundaries are as well. But let's move beyond the Olympics to the reality. So the work I do is very much in the space of organisations. We have started to look at some stuff in sport and also some stuff in politics. And a lot of my work looks at what barriers do people face, what gaps and blind spots do humans have. Because the more we can close those gaps, the more we can shine a light on some of those blind spots, the more effective we are when we come together as teams. And whether that is on a field playing sports, whether that is in a meeting room designing a new project, whether that is within our own homes navigating partnerships and relationships and friendships with the people around us. I'm lucky enough to have been able to take stages in lots of different places. Last week I was at the Labour Party conference trying to get politicians to answer questions. Bloody hard work. Sometimes you've got to ask a different question because they start answering the question they want you to ask. But ultimately, yeah, I think I've had a lot of opportunities over the past few years to share some of the things that we've learned. But actually, a lot of people say, Lee, you're doing some great work. And I'm like, what's not really important is what I'm doing today or where I am today. We should always really think about where we started. So for me, my journey started in the lovely town of sunny Bolton in the northwest 39 years ago, and grew up on an estate and saw the world very differently. But what I did have in my life was a few adults who believed in me, a few adults who were willing to kind of keep me on the straight and narrow, I should say. And they actually meant that I became the first one in my extended family to go to university. And that gave me an educational pathway that was an opportunity to start to think about how I could make a difference in the world. I ended up starting a business from my bedroom, which then grew across Europe. That put me in a leadership position very young. The picture on the left is how it started. The picture on the right is what it became 10 years later. But ultimately, my business journey, for all the mistakes that I made being a young leader, it's not that important. It's what I've taken from those challenges, because leadership in itself is something that you develop and requires a lot of work on you and then really seeing how you can bring that to other people in a powerful way. What I want to share is how I started doing this work, because if I'm honest, when I was involved in elite sport 13 years ago, I wasn't very aware of the barriers that women or girls faced, because I've not really experienced any of them myself. I faced a bit of racism growing up, but actually I never really considered the impact that others had, some of the lived experiences that they had. What was interesting is 10 years ago my immune system failed, and that pretty much left me paralysed. And it's funny the lessons that you learn when suddenly you can't do anything for yourself. So I'd gone from being very independent, mobile, physical, being able to play sport, and fundamentally being able to do and have the autonomy to do what I wanted to do. And all of a sudden, I had nurses wheeling me to the toilet, people helping me feed myself, healthcare assistants helping me shower. And there isn't really anything more humbling than having that independence stripped away. But what that actually did, I was in a hospital bed for about 5 weeks reflecting on, had I made an impact in the world? How was I going to get back on my feet? Actually, had I been grateful for all the things that I'd had, the opportunity of free education, this free healthcare that I was receiving, growing up in a developed country where I had access and opportunity, the freedom to even set up a business is not something that every single person has on this planet. And from there, what I realised is that actually I need to use this adversity as a driver to make change. I went into walk-in rehab and my daughter was born. And I had a reason to get back on my feet. I had something to target. Many of you in this room who are quite driven and have a competitive spirit within you will know what a target does. It drives you towards doing everything you can to achieve it. I was determined to get back on my feet so I could take my daughter's first steps with her. That would also mean that I'd beat her to walking. 11 months later, I was able to walk a mile without any walking aids. And that meant I was able to take my daughter's first steps with her, which is probably the most, and is definitely the most proud moment of my life, and probably will be, no matter what I go on to achieve. What I will say is I beat her to walking. I've not beat her much else since. So she's 10 next week. And I spend most of my weekends stood on the touchlines, watching as she plays mixed sport, gets stuck in, and smashes a few people around. But that also means that she runs rings around me all the time too. So yeah, I think that for me, it was a starting point. It made me reflect on actually what have I been missing, and the power of having that support network. Because without my support network, would I be still standing today, 10 years later? What I realised earlier is that tomorrow is the 10-year anniversary of when I was discharged from walk-in rehab into intensive physio. So it's quite fresh in my mind, that journey. But actually, 10 years later, to still be probably 70% of what I was beforehand, there's a lot of gratitude for that. But where this work started is after recovery, I had the option to go back into the senior leadership role at the company that I built. And I actually decided I didn't want to. I became a stay-at-home dad instead. Started out as I'm going to do it for 6 months and see how it goes. A few people had some choice words to say about that. Got called a loser. I got told it was career suicide. Someone said, you'll be back in 2 weeks. And another person said, well, what's your wife doing? Those 6 weeks became 3 years. So both my children started school. And I just had that time. And I could spend at least half an hour telling you about all the lessons I learned in that 3 years. But I'll tell you just 2 very quick points. It was the most effective leadership and development training course that I have ever been on. I reckon I could negotiate my way out of a hostage situation, having gone through the experience with my 2 little ones. But also, it's the first time I spent a significant amount of time in female-dominant environments, having had a background in tech, in finance, in sport, and being one of 3 brothers. And that just changed my perspective. I saw my gender very differently in those rooms because I was the only father in my local baby and toddler group. So it's an incredibly powerful experience. My gender was held up in the mirror in a different way, and actually being able to listen to the stories of the mothers and grandmothers in that room and gradually building trust for them to tell me things that they'd been through made me realise that every single woman in that room had a story. And these were things that I just hadn't noticed, things that I hadn't really been party to, but actually made me think, if every single woman in this room's got a story, and I look at it in wider society, I went back to interview some of the female members on my team in the company that I'd built, and lo and behold, they had stories as well. And I was just, why is no one talking about this? And fundamentally, why isn't anyone doing anything about it? So that's where this journey started. And what happened is, when my children went back to school, I thought, I need to do something to make a difference, but I don't really know what to do. So I started to explore, how could I turn some of this awareness into action? Because the truth is, I'd spent a lot of time listening and starting to learn things that I didn't know, but also unlearn some of the conditioning of the things that I'd been told I should be as a man, that actually didn't really resonate very closely with me. And during that period, I came across the word allyship. And I was like, that's interesting. It sounds like something, well, firstly, I thought it sounds like First World War, allies. Which countries are going to come and join and fight with us? And I thought it's a bit militaristic. I'm not sure if I like that so much. But actually, I decided to dig into the root of the word to think about what it actually meant in practice. What did it mean in the modern world? And what we actually found is that the word originated from Old French, the Old French word allier, which means to combine, to unite, and to come together. And I felt that in a society that can be quite divided at times, in a society where there's lots of different perspectives, in a society where things can feel a bit dynamic, a bit uncertain, and a bit volatile, what could be more powerful than finding ways to bring people together, to find unity within the discourse, and to actually combine our skills, perspectives, and differences to actually make things better? Because we all know fundamentally, if you look across a sporting team, everyone's got a position to play. Their skills align in that space. If everyone was the same on the team, it wouldn't work effectively. And I think that we don't often consider just how important that is in our everyday lives. So having explored the concept and thinking, this is what it means, because I love to find the root of what something means. Where did it start? I actually started to think, how does this play out? And I suppose, why did I end up getting interested in this in the first place? Well, one of the reasons is, during that period of exploring, I came across this statistic. With more than 4/5 of women feeling some form of exclusion in the workplace, but almost all men not realising that they actually were. And the truth is, when you explore this deeper, this is a very, very big gap in perception. But actually, the actions that, I suppose, undertake this are not often personal, are very rarely intentional. And a lot of them are due to how the systems have been built. Because the majority of things that we have, both physically, systemically, through design, even the way that things have been researched through science, have almost always been from a male perspective, through a male lens, often with male dimensions, male cells used. And again, that's a whole other discussion that we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. But when there's gaps to close, if we can close gaps, it actually helps us to be more effective together. So how do we actually start to explore this? So I'm going to share a few of the things that we've done in our work that have started to gain traction and also helped us to research and understand some of the challenges that people face. The first one is exploring privilege. Now, I'll be honest, out in society at the minute, privilege is a bit of a prickly word. No one really likes talking about privilege because it can be seen as used in a way that's slightly weaponized against people. and actually used in a way to shut down conversations rather than open conversations up. One of the things that we found really powerful is to not look at privilege as what people do have. Because the amount of things that we have that are labelled as privilege, almost all of them are actually out of our control. Are you in control of who your parents are? Because who your parents are have a massive determinant on who you are. Do you have control over the gender or ethnicity that you are? Do you have control over where your parents sent you to school, the hobbies that you enrolled in, their friendship networks who become your friends? Very few people have control over that. In fact, the majority of your network is built before you become an adult and start networking yourself. So actually looking at privilege as what people do have will make people feel that you're actually saying, well, you've not worked hard to get to where you are. No one likes to be told that. Instead, we look at privilege differently. Privilege is what you don't have to do, the things you don't have to face, the questions that don't run through your mind when you walk into that room, the barriers you don't have to climb over, because actually the barriers don't exist for you as an individual or as a group. The things you don't have to consider when you leave your house in the morning, the things you don't have to think about when you get dressed for work, the things you don't have to think about or don't have to do because your sport's already funded and actually the logistics are already sorted. So often, privilege is about the things you don't have to do. And the things you don't have to do give you the capacity to do other things. So if I think about the work that we do, I was a stay-at-home dad. All of a sudden, my mental checklist of things that I had to do to get both my toddlers out of the house increased by about probably 7 or 8 times. All of a sudden, I was very, very mentally tired. And then I realised that this is how most mothers feel every day. And it was little moments like that that made me actually realise, wait a minute, oh, God, I forgot that change of clothes. There's just been a bit of a punami, and I'm a bit exposed right now. But it was those moments that actually made me start to think, what have I not had? Because I realised that a lot of my life had been facilitated around me. Therefore, there were a lot of things that I just didn't think about until I was put into that situation. And actually, that became a point where we started to look at privilege as about the things you don't have. Because when people start to realise the levels that some people have to go to keep themselves safe in society, the levels that people have to go to actually be even close to who they are in certain situations, the actual feeling of being marginalised and excluded regularly, having jokes made at your expense, but everyone in the room laughing. Until you think about what it feels like, you don't realise. So that's why we explore privilege as what we don't have to face, the barriers we don't have to climb, the things we don't have to navigate, because it opens up a conversation and gets people curious about what they don't have to go through. What I will say is we've also researched what are the barriers to actually becoming an ally. Obviously, allyship itself is an interesting concept. The fact that you could partner with people who've had different experiences to you, because when you partner together, change is more effective. Historically, marginalised groups have had to advocate for themselves, which is a challenge. Because when you're climbing over more barriers and obstacles, when you face more adversity and challenge, and you still have to try and change a system that's still unbalanced against you, it's not really fair to have the person who's run the marathon still line up on the 100-metre line against the person who's completely fresh, in the blocks and ready to go. And sometimes, from an equity perspective in our society, some people start the race outside the stadium, and the barriers on their track are significantly more. I didn't see that earlier in my life. I used to think, oh yeah, I treat everyone the same. That's what being an inclusive leader is about. And that's how I used to be. And I used to really think I was doing the right thing. In that, I never considered that actually some of my team has significantly more barriers than others. And by treating everyone the same, I wasn't actually making any difference to those barriers. What are the barriers for actually stepping in to be an ally? Well, a lot of our research is around men stepping in to changing systems so they become more equitable and fair from a gender perspective. So we asked our sample, which is around 137 men, what was stopping them or what had stopped them stepping into this work. Anytime you do anything like this, fear comes at the top. Fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of upsetting people, fear of being judged, fear of having to step in and challenge someone who's being sexist and misogynistic. So much of it is driven by not actually being sure how to navigate that, how to question people, how to actually challenge effectively. And also fear of judgment, because historically, male-dominated cultures don't challenge sexism. So we feel in our work it's really important to explore what those barriers are, because it's only by working with those barriers we can actually get more partnership happening for change. And these barriers work across ethnicity, across disability, across sexuality, and even across socio-economic gaps. And what's really interesting is, obviously some of these characteristics, especially socio-economic, are deeply rooted in this country and significantly weave into every aspect of our identity. And yet, how often do we truly talk about classism in society? But by thinking about these barriers, we've started to work out how we can take men on that journey. Because it's really important that we actually come together and start to make a change. Because we do have a society that's also starting to feel that, I mean, if we're honest, the recent Ipsos survey, where 56% of UK men said that gender equality is already done. Actually, it's going too far. And we found from our sample, which is probably slightly more inclusive than the general population, 41% of them actually felt like there's too much focus on it. So there's a disengaged group who actually think that men are starting to get discriminated against. And feel quite strongly about that, because there are certain individuals online who have influence who are also saying very similar things. What I will say is men do have some significant systemic challenges in society around our mental and physical health, around suicide and addiction, around boys' educational attainment, which is something our business is actively working on. That doesn't mean that there aren't significant barriers for women across health, across business, and actually just across wider society. We both have these challenges, but what's really interesting is if you look at the root of these challenges, the root causes for the damage to men and the damage to women is almost always the same. So by working together, we can actually change the systems that make it better for all of us. It also makes business sense. And what we also find in our work is that when initiatives are driven by both men and women in collaboration, instead of just one gender driving change, it becomes so much more effective if it's a joint project from a gender perspective, especially in the design, the communication, the embedding, the delivery, and how it's monitored going forward. And while this statistic from Boston Consulting Group was focused around gender-based initiatives in the workplace, we actually find a very similar pattern in other initiatives around productivity, around innovation, and around other kind of project-based initiatives that are trying to move towards our outcomes. Ultimately, when we come together, work becomes more effective too. Now, I just want to cover some misconceptions around allyship. There are a lot out there. Some people think it's just for gender or race. Everyone can be an ally. In fact, allyship is more a skill set than a way of being in many ways. And it's about actions, not just about what we say. If I reflect back to me thinking that everyone was equal and I should treat everyone equally, and that being inclusive, that's a misconception and a mistake I made. Another one was when I was hiring, I always looked to pick the best person for the job. I used to think that that was the meritable thing to do. That was exactly what an inclusive organisation would do. On reflection, 10, 11 years later, what I've actually realised is by doing that, I didn't realise how subjective my perception of merit was. Because what we think is based on merit is actually based on what we value. And what we value and what we believe impacts how we think someone deserves something. The challenge as humans is that we think merit is very objective. And therefore we don't see our own biases at play in that process. A way to get around this, a way to make it different, is to have a wide variety of people within that recruitment process. But an easier way to actually think about it is actually starting to look for the best person for the team, not the best person for the job. Because as soon as you look at it from a team perspective, you'll actually get to see who's going to add something to the team, who's going to bring something slightly different, who's going to bring something that isn't just a repetition of what we've already got, or someone who fits the very typical mould. And by working on that process, because again, in sport, you might have and think about the best person for the role being the most elite player in the country in that position, but put them on a bumpy pitch on a cold Tuesday night out the back end of nowhere. They might be best person for the role on paper. Are they really going to perform within that team? Even ways to think about looking at things from a different perspective. But think about the best person for the team rather than looking at the role. Because at the end of the day, whether it's in sport or it's in business, where there's a team involved, where is performance measured? Individual performance might be measured, but it's a team performance that actually creates sustainable outcomes and the achievement that we're looking to attain. But probably the biggest misconception, now I know I'm tempting fate by putting a picture of pie just before lunch. I do apologise. But actually the biggest misconception in our work is that by thinking about removing barriers for others will actually mean that we give away a piece of our pie. Because no one wants to feel like they're losing, and no one wants to feel like things will become more scarce in their supporting of others. But actually what we've found in our research, and this plays out in wider society, when we engage in allyship and start to break down some of those gaps, it's not about giving away a piece of our pie. It's about baking a bigger pie together. And actually, when we come together, we see everything from stock market indices to productivity figures to innovation and creativity opportunities. We see them increase. That fundamentally is that bigger pie in action. And the bigger the pie, the more there is to share. Abundance, not scarcity. And actually realising partnering with other people isn't about direct competition, it's actually collaborative and creates a bigger pie for us all to share. And if you bring some true diversity to the party, you're going to get some more flavours of pie as well. Different recipes to the mix, different perspectives. And to be honest, in a world where there's 26 flavours of ketchup on your supermarket shelf, who doesn't want a few more flavours of pie either? So as we come towards the end, what I want to share is some of the perspectives of those men who've been on the journey, who we've seen develop. But more importantly, we wanted to know, what's it actually done for you engaging? Because one thing we very rarely talk about in inclusion or in leadership is what it actually does for men when they step into it. I mean, I'll be brutally honest. A lot of the work I do is around creating gender equity within systems. But if we look at inclusion in the workplace, historically, it's not marketed very well towards men. Sometimes, even in the projects, men don't get included. And inclusion is about everyone. And I think sometimes we do need to look at how those structures have been created, because that does mean that men are less likely to engage in a lot of these things. But actually, when we start to look at what's in it for men, it's a conversation that sounds very transactional. Like, what's in it for me? What do I get out of it? Why should I? But actually, we can answer that question if we can actually get men to see what's in it for them. All of a sudden, it becomes a different conversation. So, what are some of the things? Well, again, we've interviewed over 100 men who stepped into inclusion to ask what they've got from it. And it's really interesting because men, there's commonalities in the answers. Definitely things around being more deeply connected to themselves, being more self-aware of the around them, becoming more of a leader who serves than a leader who's focused on themselves. And definitely things around the lessening of ego, becoming a bit more vulnerable and a bit more transparent with people around them, and they become a bit more compassionate, a bit more connected to themselves. One of the really interesting things that we've seen is that almost all of them referenced that they actually were more likely to open up to other men, and they were more likely to get themselves checked out if something had been hurting for a few days, which, you know, for most of you in this room, you'll probably have had to tell a man in your life, stop complaining about it and go and get it checked out. And actually, it's given men quite often more agency to look after themselves and a bit more kinship with the other men around them. And that connection is really important, because if we look at many of the struggles of men in society, a lot of it is around connection, true connection to ourselves and true connection towards other people as well. And again, it's interesting to see how the benefits and the what's in it for them has come out both in terms of internal things, such as how they feel about themselves, that compassion, that kindness, a bit of forgiveness, but also made them think about the awareness externally, and has helped them to actually realise quite often something that I talk about, which was before I became a stay-at-home dad and started to explore this, I would say my world was pretty black and white, but I didn't know it. As soon as I started to truly listen to women, and not the kind of the listening, like thinking what I'm going to say next, or the listening and being like, shuffles through male experiences, is there a comparable one that I can start talking about? Or drifts off and starts thinking about his lunch. I actually started to see dots of colour in the world, and that got me curious, because then I went out into society and saw some more dots of colour, and then started to realise that there was a lot of inequity out there. And then I started to feel uncomfortable, and then I actually thought, I should actually do something about this. And I think it's really powerful, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that does then turn the kind of the complacency around it into a choice. Are you going to do something? Or are you just going to continue to float through life? Because doing something actually is really powerful. What we actually find is in more gender equal societies, the benefits of men are significant. And this has played out as they've looked at different nations on the journey over the past 50 years. But if you sit down in front of anyone and ask them, do you want more sleep? Better physical and mental health? Deeper relationships? More intimacy with your partner? Would you like to have more friends? Would you like to feel easier navigating the world around you? The reality is, these benefits, I've not met a person yet who's looked at that and said, no, I don't want more sleep. I don't need any of these things, I'm absolutely fine. Because when you break it down, you realise that if we can work together to create that society, everyone is benefiting. And I'm incredibly passionate from being a stay-at-home dad about working to make paternity and parental leave better in this country. Because getting a few pounds change and being given 2 weeks to bond with your child, it's a joke. And I've said that quite bluntly to some people in politics about how it needs to change. Because if we take out in Scandinavia, I sold my company to a Danish conglomerate. I was talking to them about me taking 3 years out. They were like, yeah, really blasé about it. Because men over there have to take 4 months. A family gets a year. Obviously, family setups are very, there's lots of different family setups. But a male partner in that family, you get a year, split into 3 chunks. The man has to take 4 months or the partnership loses it. So what does that mean? On the streets of Copenhagen, dad cafes, groups of dads walking along with the prams, smiling. Not sleeping, but smiling. And it's just a very different societal narrative because they have those bonds with the children. I think about my 2 now. They're 11 and 9. My 11-year-old has started secondary school. He's almost as tall as me. But the bond I've got with them is, I couldn't trade that for time or money or for anything else. So, yeah, the benefits are massive. But I suppose if we were to look at the quantitative aspects as we come to a close, 80% of the men that we surveyed said that engaging in inclusion had actually made their business a better place to work, made their business and have a level of competitive advantage in the market, and fundamentally made leadership different. 97% of them said engaging in it had made them a better human or a better leader. And that says a lot. So to kind of bring it to a close, because I can almost see the sandwiches unwrapping from the other side, these glasses are quite powerful, is that it's the small things. And I talk to a lot of men who think, so I need to make big sweeping change, I need to come and then kind of do what the comic book heroes of their childhoods do, is whack the cape on, lovely kind of bodysuit, and come and save the day. And the truth is, men don't need to come and save the day. We just need to start to do small things in our everyday world. Those small compounding actions make ripples, and if everyone takes some of those small compounding actions, we don't just compound into better leaders. Those ripples become waves of change, start to change the cultures that we exist within. Especially those cultures where historically women haven't had the opportunity. Because I speak to young girls, they see women in so many different fields now that their own parents didn't. That representation is powerful, but behind the representation are stories and systems that still stop those narratives and those dreams becoming true. But we can all be part of making children's dreams happen and opening the pathways so that they can not only aspire, but attain to the places where they can become. So, to leave you with some thoughts, 3 types of allyship actions that people can take. Individual ones is working on yourself, self-education, starting to think about some of your own biases and how they come to play, and then thinking about the interpersonal, how they come out as you interact in the world around you. Finally, systemic, structural changes where we can all use our ability and our position to actually make processes around us more equitable. And that means that it will benefit not just the people that we meet, the people within our teams, but actually people who we might never come across by making that difference. So the key levers in the workplace for that, if you're in a position to influence meetings, networking opportunities, we had some real fun earlier talking about golf. I find golf really interesting because, how should we say it? It is a place of networking, but actually sometimes there's a bit of a glass ceiling in business. Literally a grass ceiling, not a glass ceiling. But in itself, thinking about how we can influence those. Are things becoming more inclusive in recruitment, in promotion processes? Are they transparent? Thinking about how jobs and projects are resourced. we can all start to think about how we can change our system. But a lot of our work, because truth be told, organisational power in this country still sits more with men than it does with women. And that organisational power is a big lever for change. So finally, like a pair of my fancy glasses, we've got a whole range of resources for people looking to step in. This is just one of them. There's many things that an ally can do. Quite often we target towards men who've historically not engaged, but actually these actions are universal. And yeah, I can talk more about these over lunch if you want to come and grab me. But fundamentally, a big thing we're talking about at the minute is leadership is changing. We're in quite a volatile space. 8 weeks ago, many of you would have been thinking about, do I even feel safe leaving the house in the UK? But that's the reality of where we're at. The next generation as well, younger people, they don't want to be led in the way that many of us have been led. They want things to become more personalised, more fair. And I've got 11-year-olds asking very pointed questions. I've also got 12 and 13-year-olds calling out adults saying, not very inclusive that, sort your language out. They will police us and they will change how we lead. And the leaders of today who are working on these skills now will be the leaders who are in a place, being able to make a difference, finding that global talent and bringing diverse teams to create the innovations and solve some of the problems we have as a society. So that's it from me. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, you can scan that code. I am quite vocal on there. I do, push some buttons. I'm outspoken. I've also got a book that's coming out in January that explains a bit more about my experience and the lessons that I've learned. And the organisation Male Allies UK launches in 2 weeks' time at Zoom's headquarters at Holborn in London. You can join that digitally if you're interested. So if you do want the link for that, I can provide it for you over lunch. But thank you everyone for your time today. And let's continue to change the world together.
Oh, thanks very much.